Good morning everyone and welcome back to Health Horizons. Today we'll be discussing the role of psychological health and safety in the workplace. While physical health and safety has long been a priority, more employers are now placing equal emphasis on psychological health and safety, a critical part of a healthy and high-performing team. This means identifying and managing the work-related factors that may pose a risk to employee mental health. Psychological health and safety is not a nice to have, it's a legal, ethical and strategic imperative. It's also about shaping organisational systems and conditions that minimise harm and promote well-being at work, not just responding when issues arise. This enables businesses to better unlock the benefits of a diverse team, improving employee engagement and commercial results. Today we'll explore what role psychological health and safety can play in your organisation, the returns it can bring and what practical strategies can create a safer, healthier and more supportive workplace. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Chanel Neski, General Manager, Wellbeing and Safety, all the way from Australia, working for Bupa in Australia, and also a psychologist by background. Welcome. Dr. Robin Clark is becoming a little bit of a regular guest for us now. So our Medical Director at Bupa Global and UK Insurance. Welcome, Robin.
Morning.
And Gethin Nadine, Chief Innovation Officer at Benefex. Gethin is also a psychologist and workplace author. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Okay, as always, please send us your questions throughout the session and we'll answer as many as we can in a little while. We've also got some lovely polls. We know you love a poll, so we've got a couple of those later on, so look out for them. Right, we've got lots to get through, so let's go again. I'm coming to you first, Chanel. So, firstly, welcome from Australia.
Thank you.
How are you getting over the jet lag?
Yes, feeling pretty okay. We'll see.
A bit of a European tour, lucky you. You might bump into your cricket team along the way. They just obviously lost to South Africa, so...
I don't follow cricket, so...
Commiserations.
Thank you.
Anyway, sorry, we're off script now. We're going to get back on script. So, to get us started, how do you define psychological health and safety in the workplace, and what creates a psychologically healthy and safe work environment?
Yeah, so psychological health and safety really is about protecting the mental health of employees. From a more traditional safety sense, we think about preventing physical injuries, things that might occur from, say, a slip or trip, a poor ergonomic desk setup, even moving a patient in a hospital or lifting something heavy on a construction site. When we're talking about psychological health and safety, we're really talking about preventing those things that could cause harm to a person's mental health in the workplace. That might be things like bullying, it might be having a really unsupportive leader, it might be exposure to a traumatic event or something like an unsustainable workload, for example. For a workplace that is psychologically healthy and safe, we're really looking at identifying the risks of harm to the people working in those workplaces and then being able to address or manage them as much as possible to mitigate those negative outcomes or prevent those things from happening completely. And what we do see in a psychologically healthy and safe work environment is that employees have the ability to be much more focused on their work, much more focused on positive connections and really preventing any negative mental health outcomes that could happen in a workplace, which really allows for a more productive environment, greater emphasis on performance, and people are generally able to thrive in those workplaces.
Great, thank you very much. So really taking the health and safety kind of physical point but across to mental health, it's quite thought-provoking really. So
Absolutely.
yeah, okay. So Gethin, can you tell us a little bit about the landscape in the UK when it comes to embedding psychological health and safety, and how do we compare to other countries?
So our legislation is not as advanced as some areas like Australia. We've talked about this quite a lot. I think what is quite interesting is we have the previous UK government and this current UK government have both hinted at employers need to do more. I think where state support in the UK is not where it used to be, and the support that most people get with their overall health and well-being, whether that's physical, mental or anything else, is just not where people expected it to, and maybe generations before kind of got that level of support. And so this is a government that clearly sees the workplace as a driver of better health outcomes for employees. And the most recent kind of King's Speech and Employment Rights Bill are indications that there is more work this government thinks for employers to do in this space. And so I think we are seeing a little bit of this handing over of responsibility from state to employers. Lots of big employers I work with globally are kind of grabbing that and running with it and understand the role that they play. We also have our main legislator, I guess, in the UK in this sense is the Health and Safety Executive. They have for a long time talked about this psychosocial risk, which is kind of exactly what Chanel was saying, the kind of how do you build the workplace to better serve somebody's health and well-being and protect them against harm. The Health and Safety Executive in the UK in the last 12 months has flexed their muscle a little bit more and has issued their first letter to an employer to say the way you are treating the mental health of your staff is not acceptable, and if it carries on, we may fine you. And so that's the loudest indication we've had from the Health and Safety Executive, I think, for some time, that they are looking at employers and they're looking closely at this. So it's really, really interesting. I chair a group in Westminster called the Policy Liaison Group on Workplace Wellbeing. We convene parliamentarians and employers and experts covering the Royal Society of Public Health, the British Psychological Society, the British Standards Institute, and we are trying to pull together duty of care guidelines for employers. And I think our reception to that kind of work is an indicator that employers themselves are stepping up to this mark, but also the government are encouraging more employers to kind of see their role in driving better health outcomes for their employees.
Great, thank you. It's interesting, isn't it? I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but you trip over at work. It's kind of obvious with physical, but mental health there's so much more than just work and your whole home life. And it's interesting that sort of onus being put on employers when it's only one part of the sort of overall. It's kind of thoughtful about that.
You also had there was a very clear delineation between work and home life for a long time. Anyone kind of 50 years above, you had work home and you had home life, and those two things never met. The pandemic and various events since, that's changed. We bring home to work, we bring work literally to home in many cases. And so I think we're even getting to the point where employers are starting to see their role in things like financial well-being, which historically felt like a bit of an overstep, but helping people to plan for the future, to keep the wolf from the door and kind of make pay go further. Lots of employers now seeing their role in that as well. So it's got quite progressive quite quickly, I think.
Lines are definitely blurring, aren't they? Robin, from a clinical perspective, what risks do businesses run if they don't put psychological health and safety on a parallel with physical health and safety?
I mean, I think that the headline here is you're effectively exposing your employees to those risks. And when they play out, you're going to see that in terms of things like deteriorating mental health, lower levels of engagement in the employee workforce. And that has ultimately a direct impact to the business itself as well. So then you'll see things like higher rates of staff turnover, lower levels of ideation, dysfunctional ways of working within the organisation. You may even see higher rates of healthcare utilisation, so it might drive up costs elsewhere in the business. So I think lots of things that you will see in terms of kind of the clinical knock-on impact as a result of not addressing this. I think also you've got that sort of the legal and compliance issue. So I mean, I don't think you can overstate that enough. That actually, from a health and safety perspective, actually, the psychological well-being of employees is very much part and parcel of that, and a core thing that you should also be looking out for. So yeah, absolutely. If you're not focusing on that, then those risks can very much materialise.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm going to come back to you, Chanel, because I know it's a bit different in Australia. So as Australia has been introducing more overt regulations around psychological health and safety in previous years, tell us how this has been received by employees and organisations. Have there been any changes?
I think it's generally been received fairly well. I do think that as employees, as organisations, life's challenging enough, and what Gethin was saying before, life's challenging enough. We don't want people to come to work and have more challenges at work. Work should be a safe place, both physically and psychologically. So when we are looking at the new regulations that have come in Australia, we've always been required to look at psychological health and safety as a part of a traditional health and safety legislation. However, it's definitely been more overtly called out, which has made it a bit clearer now to employers as to what exactly they should be doing for their employees. From a change or I guess challenge perspective and what we're seeing, I think some organisations, particularly those that may not have been resourced in this area or not really know how to tackle those increased expectations around psychological health and safety, I think it has been a little bit overwhelming and potentially a bit unclear what to do, and that's why the guidance material that we're seeing coming through and as things move forward, it is becoming a lot clearer. So that's really great to see. But I would also say, similar to what you were saying before around when we're talking about risks to the mental health of employees, they're more invisible than a physical hazard or a physical risk. So it is more difficult to understand how might we go about managing or addressing or controlling that risk. And I think that can be a little bit overwhelming for organisations too. I also think we can't shy away from the fact that mental health still has stigma attached to it, or mental illness in the workplace, and leaders are often unsure. How much can I ask? How much should I get involved here? But when it comes to risks in the workplace, it is absolutely necessary to get involved. It is our obligation to manage those risks, to be able to set our employees up for success in our workplaces. So I think we have been really lucky to have these regulations, and I think it will have a really good long-term benefit once all organisations get their head around it a bit more.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, mental health has long been a subject in business, and many businesses have things like EAPs and so on, which feel quite reactive. This feels much more proactive, on the front foot, really driving change and support much more actively, and looking at those risks. Cool. Okay, so Gethin, the role of wellbeing and the wellbeing market has dramatically changed over the last 5 or so years. What role does wellbeing play in all of this?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So I think I've thought about this quite a lot, because the pandemic was clearly a watershed moment in how we think about workplace wellbeing. It forced a lot of employers to think about employee care in the way that we're talking about today, perhaps for the first time. I think what's interesting is, in order to try and understand this myself, I looked back over the last 150 years of kind of big changes that drove change in society that drove changes in the workplace. And so where you have large workplace legislation, that typically followed a change in society. So kind of the public's behaviour or attitude changes, and then the government responds to that, and that in turn changes the workplace. And if you look back, kind of the late 1800s, you've got mills closed because people died in mills and they were just deemed unsafe. And so then a legislation would come in that said working hours were short, or children were not allowed to work in mines. So all these kind of different pieces of legislation 100 plus years ago. And typically what I found is it's about a decade after those big changes that we really started to see the workplace change. And if you take the pandemic as that watershed moment, 2025, we are halfway through that 10-year period. And I think that's why, to add to what my fellow panellists have talked about, this is why employers are struggling with it, because we're still in the midst of that change. It's not settled down yet. And I think when I wrote my second book, one of the chapters I struggled with most is how to define well-being, because there's no universal definition. And especially when it comes to the workplace, that's even more challenging. But broadly, I think it's the market commodified well-being really well. So the pandemic led a lot of people to go and buy a lot of mental health apps and well-being apps, and we saw a massive surge in sales of those apps. To solve the problem, three years later, when those contracts were up, people stopped and reflected, was that the right thing then? Was it the right thing now for the next couple of years? And obviously what we're now starting to see is employers understand the role of the kind of products that benefit support, Bupa support, the employee benefits that people can get through the workplace. But generally speaking, I think it's, if you take well-being as 3 separate parts in the workplace, you've got the structural element, so how we design the workplace to better serve, and that's a lot of the stuff that you've talked about, which is how we're training managers, how we're recruiting managers to have conversations with people about mental health, etc. The structural way that we serve well-being and the way that we design organisations is something that employers need to do, and people like us really can't help how they change that. You've then got the support you offer, so when people go through difficult things in life, we're there for them. So a lot of the stuff that Bupa does, I think, plays into this. So if somebody gets a diagnosis, and how do they deal with that? If people are off long-term ill health, how do we get them back to work quickly? And then the third one is employee behaviours themselves. You could have an organisation that does everything that works and by the book when it comes to well-being. But if that person themselves is not taking care of themselves and is either overweight or not active, they will obviously have low well-being. So regardless of the employer doing all the right things, that individual kind of also needs to take ownership of their well-being. And in my experience, it's turned into, how do we get those 3 things kind of in process? How do we help people navigate life and the things that will happen? How do we support them to drive better behaviour so that they are more empowered and educated to look after their own well-being? And then how do we structure organisations to better serve well-being? And I think that's kind of what we've gone through over the last 5 years is, okay, we understand now this is probably the way you should look at it. It's not about going out and buying stuff necessarily. It's a combination of different decisions employers need to make.
Great. It's really encouraging to hear that we're making a little bit of progress. Quite a lot of progress in the UK. Still feels like there's quite a lot to do.
Absolutely.
One thing I'm actually interested in from the discussion so far is, and you can't really categorise someone's mental health or their life, but I'm going to just briefly. How far do you think you should reach from work in someone's personal life? Or is it just about how far they want to let you in? I mean, that's because it's categorising in a way is not that helpful, is it? Or is it just about marking the risks and making sure you're set up right at work? I don't know whether you want to answer that or reflect on that. Or
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's always down to the individual to kind of how much they want to let in, but we are seeing a lot of movement. The Royal Society of Public Health in the UK are starting some management training. They're trying to develop training to allow managers to have more conversations about well-being because they know that will benefit public health in the UK. And so again, I think we are seeing the workplace as a way of delivering care and support and kind of little bits of healthcare in a way that we haven't seen before. But ultimately, I think if managers can start having active conversations about how somebody's mental health is, we're not trying to solve the problem for people. We're just trying to, most of the time, give them a platform to say, I'm struggling, to be able to work around that in work so we can accommodate that, but also then direct people to the most appropriate support. So, but I think there's a lot of evidence that it's really beneficial for us as employers to proactively start those conversations with our people.
yeah, great, thank you.
To build on that, people spend so much time in the workplace. Workplaces do have a really amazing opportunity, as do universities, as do schools, to really make sure that the environment is conducive to, if people do have anything that they're struggling with, whether it be personal or work related, that they do have a comfortable space to be able to share that and get the support that they need. And I think absolutely necessary is for workplaces to manage those risks within the workplace's control, and that is a 100% workplace obligation, and then to also be able to create environments where people feel safe to reach out for personal support as well. It is really something that I think not only benefits the employee, it also benefits the workplace as well.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Right, we're going to move on to our next section now. It's the moment you've all been waiting for. So our first poll, do you think your organisation places equal emphasis on psychological health and safety compared to physical health and safety? Yes or no? We'll bring the answers back to you later on. Right, okay, so now the next part of today's session, we're going to talk about practical strategies to create a safer workplace. So Robin, I'm going to come to you first. Work can play such a big factor in people's life. New research from the CIPD states that 25% of people feel their job has a negative impact on their mental health. What should organisations be prioritising to address this?
I think the main thing is about being proactive, keeping your ears and eyes open, and trying to make the changes in advance of that action actually being needed. So really being ahead of that curve. So a little bit like some of the points that we've already touched on. So, job structure, ways of working. Actually think about that in advance when you've got roles coming up, and who are you recruiting into them? How are they going to be supported? Because it's far better to do that in advance rather than run into a problem and then think about how you're going to redesign it. So I think that's very important. I think we've spoken a lot about how work can be a positive as well. It's quite protective of mental health. It's good to have that routine. It's great for sort of socialisation. So it's great to keep people in work, and so we should do whatever we can to enable that structure so that people can continue to turn up to their workplace. Back to my earlier point about keeping your eyes and ears open. I think I like the phrase, if you treasure it, measure it. So what can you do in terms of well-being surveys? What feedback are you getting? What are you getting from one-to-ones? Can you detect when there's some dissatisfaction creeping in, and what can you do about it? So I think being very reactive, so trying to set it up correctly in the first instance, being reactive to what's going on, and then try and change and pivot when you detect some of those risks coming out. And I think the other thing is about that supportive culture. So having those open conversations and enabling people to have those conversations. So, skilling them up, skilling up the managers, rolling out training, so that actually the workplace is a nice place to turn up to and people feel comfortable turning up to it.
Yeah, if you treasure it, measure it, I like that.
Yeah.
And also for line managers, I mean, it's not necessarily an easy conversation to have, is it? So I absolutely get there's an element of training, isn't there, in terms of creating the environment for people to be able to discuss things. Okay, so Chanel, what practical steps can leaders take to manage psychological health and safety?
I think firstly, leadership is absolutely key to a psychologically healthy and safe environment. I think as an organisation, to be able to enable your leaders, similarly to what you were saying, having a position, whether that be a policy or something, on what psychological health and safety means for your workplace is a really good place to start. You may have a standalone policy like we have at Bupa, or you may just make sure that your work health and safety policy has really strong integration of psychological health and safety as well. And that really sets the expectation for the organisation and the expectation for the leadership of that organisation and for employees. So the next step really is making sure that those expectations are well integrated from the very, very top, your executive team, as well as the leaders, and that might look like awareness around what is psychological health and safety, what does that mean for leaders, how should leaders lead in an environment where psychological health and safety is a top priority, and it should be. From there, as Robin was saying, when we're thinking about the practice of psychological health and safety, consultation is key. So really understanding from your employees what are the things in the workplace that could cause them harm. And they know, they're the ones doing the work, they're the ones we need to listen to. So whether that be a psychological health and safety survey or risk assessment, where you're really understanding what your top risk areas are, where you can do most work, and then from there making sure you've not only got quantitative data from a survey but also qualitative data through those one-on-one conversations or focus groups. So you're really putting context to the data and the information that you're getting. After that, once you do know your risks, it's really, really important to act. So mitigating those risks or addressing those risks as far as what is reasonably practicable is really, really important. And it's really good to show your employees that you're seeking their feedback on what we could do about some of the things in the workplace that could be causing them concern. And I think from there, measuring what you're doing to be able to make sure that the things that you have put in place are working, and if they're not, adjusting those things really helps close that loop and makes sure that we are continuing to set up a really sustainable, safe environment. I think the other thing that leaders should do, and they can do this and they should do this at all times, is really lead by example, and that might look like setting really healthy boundaries around their own workload and their own work-life balance, for want of a better term. I think as well having difficult conversations, and I will say psychological health and safety isn't about not leaning into challenges or not giving feedback or not having tough conversations. That is all a part of being a leader, that is all a part of being employed. And I think sometimes people think, well, if I'm having a difficult conversation, if I'm providing difficult feedback, if I'm starting a performance management conversation, does that mean that I'm not looking after the psychological health and safety of the employee? And no, that's not actually the case. By not doing those things, we can sometimes introduce risk because we're not managing concerns within our teams. So I really want to say that leaders can respectfully and considerately have difficult conversations, and that is all a part of being a good leader and making sure that we're looking after the health of our employees and our wider teams as well. So they're just some things that leaders can do to support a safe environment.
There's so much in there. I mean, I agree with you. In terms of feedback, I mean, people want to know where they stand, don't they? Good or bad. So I think that's an essential part of it as well. I wonder whether, in terms of risk management, this is a way you'd manage any other risk in your business. I presume you'd advocate, defining the risk, what are the controls, what's your action plan, obviously work through with your employees. It should be managed in exactly the same way, I would presume.
Absolutely, yeah. And putting in measures, if you do identify that a process might be risky, putting in measures in place to make sure that that risk is managed. And the human resources team actually has a really key role to play here, because a lot of the risks within the employment environment come from human resources type processes like performance management or redundancy processes, and that's where it's really key to have a strong collaborative approach between your wellbeing and safety teams and your HR teams and your operational leaders for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And role modelling as well was the other bit I was going to say. So, particularly around work-life balance, if your boss doesn't leave the office till 10 at night, then guess what? Everyone else waits till he leaves, don't they? I mean, that's the old adage, you've got to role model it. Okay. Gethin, coming back to you. So you spend a lot of time with global organisations. Are there any common approaches from the businesses that are implementing this well? And do you think they're seeing the returns?
So if you look at the data from the 8 biggest industries globally, they typically spend 3 times more on people than they do capital assets. And so capital assets would be vehicles, computer equipment, machinery, kind of buildings, stock, all that kind of tangible stuff. Even in businesses that are very capital intensive, so manufacturing where you've got a lot of equipment, people still tend to spend more on people than they do capital assets. But we don't take the same return on investment calculation. We don't think about it in the same way. If you're going to buy a piece of machinery, you're going to have to justify to the business that this will produce X amount of products and this is how we'll kind of get our money back. We don't think about people in the same way. And most businesses are, the people are one of the biggest investments that they will make. And so I think the businesses that are doing this right see people as an asset that is an investment that if you nurture and you invest in, it gets better over time and it produces better results. If you take those organizations with high employee well-being, we've got enough vast and compelling global evidence now to say that the more you prioritize employee well-being, the better your business outcomes will be, whether that's shareholder return, profitability, kind of however you might measure that. Even if you don't work in a kind of revenue generating business, if you work in an NHS trust, if you work in kind of healthcare, if you work for local councils or the state, patient care gets better, patient mortality gets better in a lot of those settings. In kind of council settings in the UK, you see that frontline services improve. So whatever your measure of success, we can generally track that back to improving employee well-being. And it's because of all the stuff that Robin and Chanel have talked about. It's kind of we're creating more of the conditions for people to thrive. When people thrive, they sell more, they design better products, they deliver better customer service. We can track NPS score with employee NPS score. So your customer satisfaction increases with employee satisfaction. We know that sales teams, if we can improve their mental health, will sell more. So we can create more of the conditions for our businesses to thrive. And I think the businesses I work with that really get that and understand that, because we've talked a lot about risk. I think that's a big part of employee well-being and workplace well-being. But it's also about performance, and it's about making this whole machine, our businesses, thrive and get better and move faster. And those businesses that think of it that way, I think, are delivering more compelling return on investment calculations. So what that essentially means is they're getting more money and resource to do the things they want to do, because they're able to show their business, look, if we pull these couple of levers, we sell more, we move faster, we innovate more, we disrupt our market, we become kind of the leaders in our market. And even in the UK, we've been able to track just mentions of the word well-being or mental health in group accounts and track that to the success of the FTSE 250. So the more openly a CEO talks about mental health and things like that, so again, this vulnerability and kind of showcasing it themselves, the more likely their people's well-being is to be higher and the more likely they are to be on the FTSE 250 and be really successful. And one of the really good examples we've got how this is working at the moment is, I won't go into too much detail, but if people want to research it, there's an organisation called Irrational Capital, which is an investment company that has specifically looked at organisations with what they call a high human capital factor score. So if you get a high score, it's because you're doing a lot of the things that we've talked about. They then assessed that against 10 years worth of stock market data and found that the higher your human capital factor score, the higher your average returns are on that company in the stock market. They're actually double what the average stock market is. So anyone out there who wants to go and invest in a company, find a company with a high human capital factor score, because your returns are about 20% versus about 10% stock market on average. And this is very interesting to shareholders and very interesting to investors. And we are now starting to see lots of shareholders and investors become very interested in workplace well-being, because the evidence shows us this drives all the outcomes to get more financial returns effectively. And so I think businesses who see this as a way of making their business better, not just mitigating risk, kind of get this better and actually tend to be performing better. So that's one thing I'd like every employer to know, that this is not some left-wing liberal idea anymore. This is driving progress for organisations.
And as with so many things we discuss on Health Horizons, leadership is such a key part of this, isn't it? Leaders stepping into the space, role modelling, willing to be vulnerable, not claiming to know everything, super important. So Chanel, coming to you now, to bring this to life for everyone, can you share with us a case study or an example where you've seen managing any risks to employee mental health work well, and any success stories you've seen?
Yeah, I can share a scenario where we saw some really great leadership come out of our health insurance team in Australia, particularly our contact centre. And I mean, contact centres are, really renowned for high levels of attrition and high levels of absenteeism, sickness absence, I think you call it here. The leader of this area was really proactive in understanding what types of things were impacting her team and really wanted to do something about it. And another layer, I guess, to this case study is we did a psychosocial risk assessment, or a survey which was specifically focused on psychological health and safety in this particular area. And one of the, actually the top risk was the fact that people thought that their workload was consistently high. So we already knew that in terms of this particular team's risk profile, they were already feeling overloaded. And then what happened is that we had an unusually long peak period where we had a number of different operational reasons. We had a number of months where our occupancy or the number of customers calling in was really, really high. That meant that our team members were having only seconds between calls, and calls were really constant, and a lot of the time the customers had been waiting for a long time, so therefore when they did come on the call they probably weren't in the best frame of mind. So all these things that happen in any call centre type workplace. So this leader was really privy to the fact that her employees probably weren't feeling as good as they could, and we were seeing a lot of unplanned leave. So she was like, I want to try something different. And she implemented 3 things. The first being making sure that things like team meetings and one-on-one meetings were prioritised. So usually when we have peak periods, those are the first things, and you would know, they're the first things that get taken out. So she was like, no, let's really prioritise those things. The second thing she did was actually lengthen the last break of the day by another 10 minutes, which meant that before the last few hours of the day, people had a bit of extra time to be refreshed. And the third thing was essentially putting in an optional wellbeing break, so that if people had a difficult call, and when you look at the nature of the calls, we're talking about distressing health information, so it could actually be quite a traumatic call, or it might be a call where a customer's got aggressive on the call, where an employee had a difficult call. They had the opportunity to take an optional wellbeing break and put themselves into a certain part of the system, which allowed the which allowed the team leader to understand that that person had taken 5 essentially and done something for themselves because of a difficult call. So she tried those things, which may seem counterproductive. You've got lots of calls coming in and you're taking people off the phone. But she wanted to try it, and as we know, based on all the research that you just said, was really positive about the potential outcomes. What we did see was that the unplanned leave for that period reduced, and when compared to other peak periods, attrition throughout that time also reduced when compared to other peak periods. The other thing which was really interesting was that by introducing that wellbeing break, instead of agents having that really difficult call and then logging off for the day and just not having the capacity to come back, we saw them coming back. So they had the time, they had the check-in with the leader, and then they came back and they were ready to take on more calls. So over time, we had our employees feeling much more supported, we had our customers being better serviced. And yeah, she got some really, really great outcomes there, which is, you mentioned, a work design, essentially adjustment, and it really did work well. I think as well some of the concerns that come with that is that would people maybe misuse those wellbeing breaks, put themselves in a wellbeing break status when actually they didn't really need it, and absolutely that did happen. So none of this comes without any risk, but that did happen a couple of times. But the fact that that additional control in place of the leader checking in with that employee to make sure they were okay really mitigated that, and people would realise that maybe that wasn't the time to use that break, and therefore they corrected that behaviour. So we did face a couple of different challenges throughout it, but overall, as you can see from the outcomes that I just mentioned, it was a really good really, really good initiative to do.
Yeah, sounds great. It's anti-intuitive, isn't it? Call centre is all about the amount of time on the phone and number of hours you've got and so on. So to take it in the opposite direction to get there in the future sounds good.
Yeah.
Think about that for my call centres.
Talk about it later.
yeah, exactly. Cool. Okay, Robin. We know that workplace stress and burnout can cause harm to individuals. What should leaders be aware of if an employee is experiencing these issues?
I think the first thing there is about being aware of the signs of burnout. What should be looking out for? What might people express? So, there's the obvious things like people just being emotionally exhausted. That reduced sense of personal accomplishment that they might get from their job. So they're just disengaging. They're there physically present, but maybe not actually present. So I think just being aware and sensitive to that in the first instance should start waving the flag. That in turn, when you start seeing that, it's likely to have a knock-on impact in terms of productivity. I think a little bit like the example that we've just had. So again, if you're seeing things like increased errors or people missing deadlines, creativity dropping off, actually, have yourself attuned to, are these people under stress? What's going on in the workplace? But also back to previous conversations, is there anything more broadly? Those gentle questions around what's going on in life more widely that might be impacting it. I think the other things that can sometimes be overlooked with burnout is the overlap with the physical health issues. So people might actually start complaining of headaches or going off with migraines. Over the long period of time, it can actually increase the likelihood of developing heart disease or musculoskeletal type issues as well. So again, I think that link between mental and physical, again, that awareness, just start asking questions, being close to your people, really just to get that gentle intel. Back to, if you treasure it, measure it. Actually, what's happening with your people? What are they telling you? And then probably the other thing to keep an eye out for is how it might play out within a team, within an interpersonal environment. So are relationships the same quality as they used to be? How is communication? Are people still seeming as social as they might have been previously? So I think all of these things bundle up together. So they should be some red flags to start gently questioning and asking yourself why.
Yeah, great, thank you. I mean, it all boils down to knowing your people, doesn't it? One-to-one time is so important, actually managing the whole human rather than just the workload, super important. Okay, Gethin, coming back to you. So this topic has the potential to feel quite complex for UK employers as they become under more pressure to be compliant. How can organisations ensure they are managing their people risk more effectively?
I mean, it is complex, right? I think we've barely scratched the surface with lots of the conversations we've had today. I think well-being touches so many areas. We've talked about, psychological safety is, well-being is underpinned by trust in the workplace. Well-being finds its way kind of seeping into diversity and inclusion and kind of how people can bring the whole selves to work and all these different parts of what makes great employment and a great employee experience. I think if you're an employer in the UK, regardless of size, this kind of legislation pressure is not going to go away. I think over time that's only going to get worse. We know there are many countries across the world that are starting to mandate things like whether people can check emails outside of working hours and that kind of stuff. And I think that will kind of continue. I think we'll start to see more pressure because all the evidence is telling us that long working hours, as we've talked about, like increased amounts of pressure and workload, it's not actually getting people to achieve more. There's a ceiling that we're hitting where productivity, especially in the UK, because the UK's productivity is one of the worst of the OECD countries. As these well-being issues go up, productivity is going down. And so for businesses to really understand well-being, they have to listen to a lot of the stuff we've talked about today and the evidence that we've got that this is about driving better outcomes for a business. The measure stuff, I think we've reiterated quite a lot, but I think it's really, really important. Understanding where your workplace is and the people who work for you, what are they struggling with, what more do they need? Anything you can do to understand what your workforce is struggling with gives you a really good foundation on what you should do next. And I don't think any of us would recommend that this is going to be perfect and that you're going to have a list of things to do and every employee is going to tick through them. I think it's start wherever you can and you'll start to make an impact. And we talked about leadership because I think that's really impactful for people. Most people's experience of working for an employer is the manager they get managed by and the team or store location or office that they work in. And so if you employ tens of thousands of people, it doesn't really come from the top down, it comes from the individual manager. And lots of people that are probably listening today who've actually got some people reporting to them. It's a difficult job being a manager as well, so part of that is also taking care of your own well-being so that you can be there to take care of the well-being of the staff. But I would say start to get familiar with this because we said at the start about the last 5 years has seen pretty significant development. The next 5 years we'll see probably double that, I suspect. The pandemic, I think, advanced these whole conversations by a decade or so, so it's moving at pace. So don't wait for legislation to come in for your organisations to start taking this seriously. Start taking it seriously now. Build that business case around the performance, whatever success looks like for you as an employer. Lean on that and show your business, this is how we get better, this is how our boat gets faster, we sell more products, whatever it is, kind of whatever good looks like. And also just keep an eye on that kind of risk element as well, because as I was saying, that legislation is going to start creeping in. And as I said at the start, employers in the UK, I think, will start to face more pressure from the government. But I guess separate to all that as well, it's not just some of the people we've mentioned, not these stakeholders that are pushing the pressure on employers, it's employees themselves. Increasingly, at Benefex, our own data found that 92% of people told us around the world that they want to work for an employer that takes care of their well-being, and that was the #1 thing that they look for. We've got big organisations that studied tens of thousands of people over the last 20 years about what do they want from work. For the first time, work-life balance has overtaken pay. For the first time in 20 years, people are prioritising their well-being in a way that other generations didn't. They want to work for organisations that support well-being. So don't be surprised if people start having interviews with you where they're directly asking, how would you support? If I went through a divorce, if I fell into problem debt, if I developed mental health, what support exists in this workplace for me? And so you're just going to get left behind, I think, if you just don't take some of this stuff. Your employees want it, the state wants it, the society is pushing for the employer to take more of a role. And I think, I would rather see any employer just start this journey than not do anything at all, and certainly not just wait until we have to do it.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. So in summary, should be doing this because it's the right thing to do. If you're not, then your employees are desperate for it. And if that still doesn't persuade you, then legislation's probably going to get you in the end anyway. So get you. That's a bit scary, isn't it? Cool. Okay. And what's the adage? People leave their leaders, not the business, don't they? That's, always pretty true, I reckon. Okay, last set question, and then we're going to get into the ones I got on the iPad, which will be nice surprises for you all. Okay, Robin, coming to you. So to wrap up our panel questions, can you share your perspective on why we should all care about psychological health and safety, and what you expect to see from organisations in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already heard quite a lot of really impactful sort of statements and reasoning for that from the panel today. I think, for me, a big takeaway is, work has a purpose. It's important for the individuals. It's important for their mental health, but it's also important for the business itself as well. So there's that, nice sort of yin and yang that's going on there. I did pull out some numbers from a Deloitte research paper from last year, which I think also kind of summarises it quite nicely. So effectively, if you neglect some of this, and actually there's that detrimental effect on employee mental health, what we're seeing at the moment is that poor mental health is costing UK employers £51 billion a year. So you can imagine that if you completely neglected this area and that deteriorated, how much extra effectively, unnecessary spend there might be in this area. Back to the point about, it's not just about what's happening in the workplace, but what's happening more broadly in people's lives. The paper quoted that 46% of working parents were concerned about their children's mental health. So actually being worried about other people in your life that are important to you can also have that knock-on impact. So if you haven't got the right systems, structures, processes within your organisation, actually you're really not helping people like this who've also got worries outside of the workplace. And yeah, 63% of respondents in the survey had at least one characteristic of burnout. So again, really waving that flag for making sure you've got the right support, you've got people trained, that actually you've got the environment where you can talk about these things and you can support people. And then finally, my last figure about return on investment. So the number quoted here was, for every £1 spent, you get £4.70 back in productivity when spent in this area. So, I think with figures like that, it's really quite easy to build a business case. Yeah. So I think, I think my takeaway for the people listening today is, use those figures, build that business case, go away and start instigating those changes, because they do really make a difference.
Yeah, that's a pretty good business case, isn't it? Great, thank you very much. Any builds? Everyone good if we move on? Cool, okay, well, we're going back to our polls, and everyone loves the polls. So, okay, result of the first poll, by the way, we've definitely got more to do. So if you remember, the question was, do you think your organisation places equal emphasis on psychological health and safety compared to physical health and safety? 44% saying yes, 56% saying no, so definitely some work to do. Okay, our second poll, do you think senior leaders in your business recognise the importance of psychological health and safety? Yes or no? Right, we've got some questions we've been given here. So this one is for Chanel and Gethin, but I don't want to leave you out, so you can answer it as well if you want. So how can you redefine the blurred lines between work and life balance, or at least cope better as these are becoming increasingly interconnected?
So I think there's no clawing it back. I think it's happened, they're blurred. I mean, what we see, there's something, as Robin was talking then, something that came into my head was something psychologists call the gain spiral, which is if somebody has a great experience at work, they're more likely to have a happier home life. We know, for example, that fathers that get adequate recognition for the efforts they put in the workplace have better relationships with their children. And you can create that circumstance. You can give your fathers more recognition, appreciate them, and they go home and have better relationships within 2 weeks with their kids. We can link fathers and parents' mental health with children's mental health and development. So, but also it works the other way around. When somebody has a really good home life, they contribute more to the workplace. And so when we think about actually, can the workplace help people outside of work, what you're actually doing is helping yourself, because you're creating more conditions for people to thrive in the workplace. And so I don't think we should ignore that virtuous cycle and almost symbiotic nature of that relationship between home and work. I think because of that, we are, and because of kind of mass hybrid and remote working and this always on culture and the fact that you can somebody can reach you kind of whenever they want, regardless of what your job is, your boss can probably text you and ask you to do something. They are becoming blurred, and that's why some of the legislation is coming in, because we have to protect ourselves and our people against some of those bad habits. It's almost the same as putting warnings on cigarette packets. If somebody doesn't tell you this is bad for you, you need to stop doing it, we might continue to do that. I think healthy organisations understand that people, especially over-engaged people, are more likely to burn out. High performers have got high prevalence of burnout, and they hold themselves to a higher account. So I think the workplace has to set some more boundaries. We're not trying to draw a wall between home and work life, but we're trying to create the conditions where we can pull people back from, I think you're taking this too far, And you might have seen stories on LinkedIn and social where a CEO sends an email at 2 in the morning, but it's got the caveat at the bottom that says, I'm sending this when I like to work. I don't expect you to respond during the same time you respond during the day that's right for you, or time that's right for you. And it's those little kind of things just kind of peppering throughout your organisation, even if they're not full and fast rules where no one can access emails after 5:30, you're creating these conditions where people don't feel ashamed to say, and it's the story you were saying where people can kind of say, I'm really struggling today and I just need to take 15 minutes, and allowing people to kind of have that autonomy over their work and really lean on the idea that the individual employee is the best measure, independent measure of their own well-being. And so listen to what they're saying. You will get a couple of people that will abuse the kind of trust you put in people, but the gains you get from the people that benefit from that will far outweigh the few people that might abuse any of that trust you give.
Yeah.
What an answer. I can't add much to that, other than rather than send your email at 2 a.m, just delay send that. That would be my recommendation there for all leaders.
I do think organisations who encourage employees to have their work email on their own phone, I mean, if I had that, that would be a disaster. I mean, I'd be wishing it, whereas it's on a different phone for me, so I can leave it somewhere in a drawer somewhere at the weekend or in the evenings and not be drawn into looking at my email. That's been one of the big changes, I think, particularly post-COVID. Anyway, so, something to think about. Right, Robin, I'm going to come to you next. So if you think someone in your team is experiencing burnout, but they're not aware of it themselves, how would you go about talking to them about it?
I mean, that's something that you've got to be very, very sensitive about, and in terms of how you approach it, particularly if the individual isn't recognising it themselves. So you may need to play that back in terms of like a reflective piece. So these are the things that we've noticed, this is what's different compared to how maybe you would normally present at work, and use that as the way of trying to open that door to see whether they'll open up and maybe there's a reflective piece for themselves to actually say, yeah, maybe you're right, maybe I have been acting and feeling differently, and these are the reasons why. So there's no hard and fast rule, but yeah, I think just do it very sensitively. Make sure you've got adequate time to do it. It's not the sort of thing where you should be trying to rush or do it in 2 minutes in between meetings. Find a quiet space, do it properly, and give it the respect it deserves.
Great, thank you very much. And then I'm going to come to you, Chanel. So in Australia, do organisations roll out any specific training for line managers on psychological health and safety?
Yeah, we absolutely have, particularly when essentially the codes of practice were coming out, and we really needed to make sure that leadership, as you can hear from everything we're saying, leadership is so key to doing psychological health and safety well. So we rolled out some pretty specific training around what does that mean, and I think the best part of that training was, what does it mean practically? Because you can go rattle off all the legislation and all the definitions and all those things, but actually what leaders need to know is practically, what do I need to do as a leader to be able to put my best foot forward in creating healthy and safe environments. So that's certainly what we did, and I 100% recommend doing that to help set your leaders up for success.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so I think we're pretty much there for today. The second poll, by the way, 41% of you think that leaders are not taking it seriously as physical health and safety. So lots for leaders to do. Thank you very much to all of you today for joining us. I guess in summary, it feels like leaders have got a huge role to play in this subject with their employees, both knowing their employees, but really being proactive in supporting them in managing their mental well-being as much as anything else. Right, this brings our session to a close. So thank you very much for joining us today. Please look out for some follow-up resources on this topic, including some brilliant content that Chanel is filming with our partners, Jack. This will be available in the next few weeks. And will be a fantastic tool to support your line managers. And we talked about the role of training today, so maybe start with that. That'd be a great place to start. I'm pleased to say that Health Horizons will be returning in September, where we'll be discussing neurodiversity in the workplace. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for joining us.